created a presentation. I'm not going to bore you to death with PowerPoint, but I think the presentation will help set the stage in terms of types of tools and resources, those types of things. And then I created a video. It's 3 different segments about turning a basket illusion platter. So we'll start with that. When we get closer to that, we'll talk about the different portions of that video. But we broke it up into 3 so we can answer questions. In this first part during the PowerPoint, feel free, ask questions. Happy to answer them. When we get to the video portion, what we'll do is it's only 20 minutes long. So we'll break it into 3, and at the end of each section, we'll stop and take some questions, if that works for everybody. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. I don't think you want to see my Home Depot email.
You doing that through the file share?
Yeah, I've got it here.
Okay.
There we go. All right. There we go. Can everybody see that okay?
Yep, we can see it.
All right, cool. So like Ted mentioned, this is going to be how to get started. I'm not an expert at this, but I can tell you the things I did wrong and what I learned along the way. So I think the basic part here is why even do it? You know, a lot of comments you guys will make, and they're fun. Don't get me wrong. It does take a long time, but you don't have to do a big piece. You don't have to make the whole piece. You don't have to do a big vessel. You can do it in a bunch of different ways. And what I got into it, I liked it because it was different. So it's a good differentiator in your work if you want to do things like markets or just for fun. It does elevate a bland piece of wood. So I look for intentionally, I didn't used to, I used to look for exotic pieces of wood, and I still do that in some of my turning, but now I want the blandest wood possible, and that's readily available. So you can elevate a bland piece of wood. There's endless design possibilities. And what I mean by that is in your patterns, you can create all sorts of different, you can go Native American, you can create abstract, you can do a bunch of things with a pattern. So that's endless. And then right now, I believe somebody said earlier, it's too cold to be in the shop. I agree. So this extends past the shop. You know, I'll turn a piece on the weekend, or I'll turn a couple pieces on the weekend. And then throughout the week, while I'm sitting in my easy chair, I can be technically working on my art, but I'm not actually standing in the shop freezing my rear off. And then the last part for me was the challenge. I think most of us got into wood turning because it's a challenge, and I think most of us like a good challenge. So if you're like that and you like a challenge, give it a try. It's not impossible. It's not too difficult, but it is challenging to work through it from beginning to end. And then what I want you guys to be able to take away is the foundational knowledge of the tools. They're not really unique, but there are some specialized tools. The resources, I put together a guide. So it's a resource guide to help you get started if you want to go down that path. And then how to develop the patterns. That was one of the things I struggled with. I had to reach out and beg a lot of people, like Jason Clark, for example. He did a demo for us a couple months ago. He and I chatted quite a bit over Instagram, him helping me trying to figure out how to develop patterns and the pitfalls of developing the wrong pattern. And then the process basics of just turning a basket illusion piece. And then obviously I want you guys to be inspired, not by my stuff, but by other basket illusion turners as well, so that you'll try it. Before we do anything, I want to acknowledge, so most of you heard of David Nipman, Harvey Meyer, Doug Schneider. These guys were real big inspirations for me and learning what they do and watching their videos. So if you're interested in this, I would go out to YouTube and like search for Harvey Meyer, for example, or Doug Schneider. Harvey Meyer is the centerpiece. For those of you that aren't familiar, that's the center picture. And he does the basket illusion on the outside and the inside of the vessel. So I may be crazy, but I'm not stupid. I'm not quite going to attempt doing the whole piece yet. And then off to the right is Doug Schneider's work. And then the left, obviously, is David Nipman. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some examples of what I've done, and I'll point out pieces that I made originally versus what I'm making today. We'll talk about the resource guide. We're going to have all that up on the website, so you'll have access to that PDF with those links to the different tools. And then wood selection, a little bit of vocabulary, nothing exciting, but just so we can all speak the same language. Pattern selection and development, the tool overview, and then we'll go over some of the process, the coloring part of it, and then obviously the finish. All right, so you guys have probably seen these from the show and tells. The one on the right was the very first platter that I turned. I used some pecan. You can see some wood discoloration in there, but it was a good experiment. I learned a lot what not to do. My beads aren't really round; they're kind of square, but it was a fun project and got a lot of good responses off that. The one on the left was the one I made right after that with a pretty common pattern that you see online quite a bit. And the one on the left is also pecan. The bases, that base on the left was my second one I made. You can tell I didn't do the best with coloring it. It's a little splotchy. I probably should have chosen different colors with stronger contrast. And then the one on the right was, that's all segmented work. And then the basket illusion, it's a lot bigger piece than the one on the left, but that's the evolution on the bases. Vessels, you guys have seen these before. The one on the left I call fall because it has the fall colors. That vessel is 14.5 inches in diameter, about 9 inches tall. And the one on the right I call the peacock. Different pattern variations, same exact segmented piece, the build out. The smaller vessels, you can do something on the left, which I think looks very Native American, and then something on the right, which looks very contemporary. You turn it upside down, that looks like a hot air balloon. You can do something whimsical there, but those pieces are relatively small, about 4 inches in diameter and 5 inches tall. And then embellishment, this one, I think, Ted pointed this out as a great point, is somebody that may not want to jump headfirst in and just spend, the next 30, 40 hours doing a large basket illusion piece. This is a good one to get started with. I literally grabbed a piece of scrap maple. You can actually see some tool marks on it. I didn't spend a lot of time, but I wanted to show how you can just do it as an embellishment. I didn't get crazy with the pattern either. I just did something very simple. This took me less than a day to make. I think it took me maybe 40 minutes because I putz around the shop to turn it, and then maybe an hour coloring and maybe 35 minutes of burning before that too. So not a big deal, but it elevates it from just a scrap piece of maple to something unique. Any questions on those pieces? Am I boring anybody yet? All right.
Doing great, Michael. That's good.
Michael, some of those smaller, like the one shown on the bottom right, about
Yeah.
how much time you got into one of those?
The one on the bottom right, because the pattern, I didn't have to color every single bead. That one on the bottom right was probably, and it's segmented too, so keep that in mind. It's probably 25 hours, but segmented, building it out, gluing it together, turning it. If it was a solid piece of wood that if I just had laying around the shop, it wouldn't have taken nearly that long. So the burning and coloring part is probably the majority of the time. The segmenting is a big portion of that.
Fabulous.
Thank you. So I'm going to click on this. It's going to open up a new page. That's fine. We'll go over this real quick. So this will be available on the website. It's all the tools and supplies and then where you can get them from. So I won't go and read these off verbatim for you, but the beading tools, I will stop and talk about the D-Way tools. I did try initially. I ordered off of Amazon some Robert Sorby beading tools, and not being negative towards them, but they just were not. It was tons of tear out. They're not built the same way that the D-Way is. The D-Way is a negative rake on those, and they just perform better. So there's a link to the D-Way. And I did have some conversations with the guys over there. If enough people said, oh, I really want to get into it and I want to order some tools, they'll do a group buy for us. I don't anticipate that happening, but if you guys all decide that you want to get some beading tools, you can coordinate through me if you want to, and we could do a group buy. Indexing wheels. So we all have indexing on our lathes, but it's very limited in terms of number of indexes. There's a couple different systems out there where you can buy an index wheel and the whole setup there. I'm using the Alisum, I think is how you pronounce it. There's a Chefware kits, and then Doug Schneider has just developed one, and he just shipped it to me yesterday. So he's got one that he's put out as well. For indexing, and it has different variations in terms of the degrees. So we'll get to why that's important in a little bit. If you have the indexing wheel, now you got to figure out a way to score your lines. So that's a platform. Chefware Kits has got a pretty easy setup there. Wood burning system, I think most of us have wood burning. And if you do not, they're readily available, obviously, the Optima, the razor tip, but it's really the pens that are important, and we'll get to that too. Polar graph paper, this has been invaluable. You can go to this mathpolate.com. You can type in how many spokes and beads you want, and you can create a polar graph, print it off on your home printer, and then you can color like me, kind of like a little kid with crayons, testing out different patterns. We'll get into that too. The sanding pads I get, we obviously can't sand heavily on the beads because we don't want them flat. So I get those sanding pads from Klingspors, pens, the X-Acto knife, because we all make mistakes, some archival spray. And then obviously, if you're like me and you can't see very well, then I have some magnifiers, and the link to that on, I think they're like $20 on Amazon. Any questions about the resource guide? Cool. All right. So let's talk about wood selection. Obviously, I want something bland. Maple is ideal. Ash will work. Bradford pear is okay. Sometimes the color variations, depending on your pattern that you see in the grain on Bradford, causes some challenge. Pecan I've used. It's not ideal because the grain's a little bit wider, but it does work, especially if you want to just practice on some pieces. But for me, it's been maple. That seems to be the best go-to, whether it be platters and it's a full 8-quarter piece of maple that I'm working on as a platter, or if it's a segmented piece, so it's all side grain.
So
Then
Michael, question for you. So how about like cherry or something like that? Is the darkness of wood, is that, or walnut, let's say, I'm just going to go extreme, right? Is that a deterrent because of the coloring?
It is, but it's not. So I've been toying around with the idea of doing walnut, doing the pattern, but not necessarily coloring the pattern, using the burn with the pen to create a pattern in the piece. So to index it, do an illusion, but then instead of coloring it, just burning it in different sections. So I don't think it's a deterrent. It depends, but if you wanted to do a colorful pattern or something Native American looking, and where there's some sanguine and some different colors in there, you're probably going to need a light piece of wood. But cherry, the same thing. My mother actually said that to me a couple weeks ago. She goes, "Have you thought about trying cherry?" And I said, "No, because it's not really." And I thought about it. I was like, "Well, actually, that's a bad idea. I probably should try it." So I agree, Ted. I want to try that and explore that and see what we can get with different color woods.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The vocabulary is not extensive at all, and my vocabulary personally is not extensive, so we're in good company. The beads, obviously, we all know what beads are. So when I say beads, it's going to actually mean two things. It's going to be the beads you see in the picture on the left, but we're also talking about when we color the individual illusion beads. And then on the right, spokes. So when I say how many spokes does that piece have, it's how many index lines is what it boils down to. Was it indexed at 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees, that kind of stuff. So that's pretty easy. I just wanted to make sure that if I'm saying a word, everybody knew what I was talking about. Pattern selection. So one of the things that I learned early on was pick your pattern first. Design a pattern and then choose what you want to put it on. And my very first attempt, I just turned a small little vessel out of a branch of maple. And then I hastily went and tried to develop a pattern real quick, and I did it on the fly. And I got done with it, and it didn't match. It didn't line up. It didn't look good. It was still my first piece, so yeah, that's cool. But I learned real quick to choose the pattern first. So a pattern will dictate a couple things. Some patterns look best on a sphere shape, like a vessel or a hollow form. Some look great with a vase where it's got the long sides, almost straight sides, and those beads are relatively the same size. And then some look really good on a platter too. So I would work on, hey, sit down and in your spare time, if you're into this, and just play with patterns. That's what I do with some of that graph paper, and just see what I can come up with. And then once you have a pattern you like with the color scheme you want, then you can start thinking about, well, is this going to look good on a platter or whatnot? The size, so how many spokes are needed? If you get into a piece, like a small piece, we'll call it 69 inches, that 90 spokes is ideal. If you try to do a tighter indexing on a small piece, let's say 144 spokes, the closer you get to the center diameter, the smallest diameter of that piece, it's going to become muddy. You won't be able to color any of the squares. The burn lines will overlap. So when you're looking at how big of a piece, let's say you're going to start working on a piece and you have a piece of maple that's going to be 10 inches in diameter, then you can start figuring out, okay, I'm probably going to do 120 spokes on that piece and then design a pattern based on 120 spokes. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, so the other, sorry, I think somebody else had a comment?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we're back to using math again. Everybody thought they didn't
Yes.
have to do it, but they do.
I'm not great at math, so don't worry. If I can do it, it's no big deal.
What I was going to say is that choosing the lesser amount of spokes makes the job a little bit easier because there's less pieces to color in, right? Less.
Yeah. Well, you're still coloring the same surface area, but you're not having to alternate colors if it's an intricate pattern or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But really it's you don't have to put a lot of thought into it, but I would recommend, from my personal experience, is design the pattern first. And it's fun just to try and figure out what patterns will look cool. It sounds kind of lame at first, but once you get into it, you start going, oh, that, what if I put this color with this color? Or what if I changed it up this way? And then once you have your patterns, I don't have it in front of me, but I have a book of patterns that I've just sat down during boring work conference calls where I don't have to participate. I just need to listen, and I'll color patterns and then apply them later. This is the polar graphs, the one I talked about. So that's that math polate. You can go on there and say, look, I want to print off a polar graph, and I want 90 spokes with 30 beads, and that would represent a smaller, let's call it a smaller platter. And then you print that off on your PC, on your printer, and then you start creating patterns. I'm going to do a bigger piece. I have a 15-inch piece of wood. Well, this probably wouldn't be the ideal 120 spokes. I'd go higher than that. But I have a 12-inch piece of 8/4, and I want to do a little platter out of it, and I want to do basket illusion. I would go print off 120 spokes by 35 beads and use that as your pattern maker. So you can get all that on the Polar Graph website and that Math Polate site. And then the size is going to dictate the proportions like I talked about before. So this example here, it's a larger diameter, we'll call it a platter. So it's got 50 beads across it, but it's only got 9 spokes. So it's only got 90 indexes, sorry. And if I do it like that, like Ted was just mentioning, if you do less spokes, it's less color area. But the thing you need to be mindful of is that top right, you can see at the largest diameter, that's a really wide bead. And then it's really pinched at the center. So think about that when you're designing your pattern. If it's supposed to look like those beads are all the same size, if that's the type pattern you designed, towards the end, it's going to look stretched if it's a minimal spokes on a large diameter piece.
Michael, question here on that. So if this is looking at as for a platter, but however, if you take a look, if it's one of those vases that you had, right, where it's round in the middle and tapers up on the top and the bottom.
Yep.
Do you do anything different here with testing out the pattern for something like that?
Typically, no, because there is a software application that you can purchase. I think it's like $15 that will let you visualize it in 3D, but it's smart. That's either I'm stupid or the application is just way smarter than I am. I can't always get it to work right. But on paper, I can visualize it for the most part. So I have not, tried to overcome that.
Okay.
And I'll show you an example. The next slide is actually an example of that.
Okay.
So
Okay. Thank you.
no problem. You guys know that one that I call fall with those fall colors. There's almost 70s style colors. This was my original idea on that. And you can see on the left, I did the pattern, which I'll call a lotus pattern. I did that first, and then I thought, well, that's really cool. And it does look cool by itself, meaning that pattern looks neat by itself. And you'll see that later. But then I was like, okay, I need to add some color to this. What can I do? And I tried different variations, and that's where I came up with that fall on the right, which I ultimately ended up using. But then I had what I call the Green Bay Packers on the left or the top. of this one, and I'll probably try to make another piece with that too. So you can see, Ted, to your question, at the outer diameter, it is starting, it would be, if you visualize it, it's starting to wrap around that vessel. But that's how I factor it all and figure out what it's kind of, give me an idea what it's going to look like in a finished piece. So that's some patterns, some other patterns. That peacock one, this was the initial, I was trying to figure out how to make something look like a water drop in the pattern. And then once I got the pattern figured out, or like fish scales almost, then I started playing around with different colors to see if I can get some depth out of each of those scales or water drops, which ended up actually becoming peacock feathers in my mind anyways. But you can see the evolution of sitting down on paper and just scribbling.
Michael, when you
those
have
two-
when you have the black in your script, is that just black marker, or are you actually burning the black in? Is every, I guess the question is every sector a marker, just a different color marker?
It is. So the vertical lines, the spokes, those are burned in. The horizontal beads, that's burned in, and we'll show how to do that in the lathe. But the actual beads that are colored, even the black ones, those are all with India ink.
Okay.
And then on the left, I did two different proofs before I finished that piece on the right. And I did the sanguine with the, I can't remember what it's called. It was a different, the orangish color. And then I did the turquoise with the black, and ultimately decided on doing a combination of the different pattern styles wrapped around that small vessel with that turquoise and black. Just to give you guys an idea of the evolution, how you get to it. So this is a question for you guys. And in fairness, I worked as an upholsterer as a kid after high school. I used to help reupholster furniture. So for me, I call it a pattern. They call it a repeat in the upholstery or the fabric business. But in this case, so how many beads, if you were looking at this pattern, let's say you go online and you're searching for patterns, either Native American patterns or pixel patterns, and you're searching online to be inspired to create your own pattern. You always want to figure out what that repeat is to make sure it matches up with how many spokes you have or how many of the index lines you have. So in this one, I guess my question, or the easy question, is how many beads create this pattern? So I'll throw that out there. And then secondary to that is, why is that even important? And I know Jim has the answer.
10?
10.
And why is it important?
You want it to come out even in your diameter around the beads.
Yep. And I know that seems rudimentary, but in some cases it was hard for me to wrap my brain around certain things, looking at patterns thinking, no, that's 11, because I wasn't counting it properly. So why that even matters is, the pattern here on paper, that'll work on something that's been indexed at 2, 3, or 4 degrees. My indexing wheel actually has a 2.5 degree mark on there too, and it would not work with that one. So keeping in mind when you index it, what kind of pattern you're going to use. And then the tools needed, some beading tools, the indexing wheel, obviously, a platform, the wood burning, magnification if you're like me, sanding, the India ink, the X-Acto knife for mistakes, and I'll show you that too in the video. And then I'm using the Krylon archival spray.
Just a question there, Michael. You have India ink pens. What exactly are they, like markers? India ink
Yes.
markers? Okay.
Yep. So
I
we'll
have
see
like
them in a
just a jug of India ink. That's all I've ever used. So they have those in pens. Okay.
Yep, and actually on like that vessel that had that Native American turquoise and black pattern, I
Mhm.
have just black India ink in a tub too. So the top part I actually didn't color because the whole top section of that was black. I didn't color with a pen. I just took a little brush and the India ink itself and dabbed that straight on because it was such a large section.
Okay.
Is that like the micron pens?
Yes, and I'll show them here in about 2 seconds. You'll see the Faber-Castell. So these are the
Michael, we got a question in the chat from Lan.
Yeah.
Said, question is, why is the black line not included in the pattern count? I assume that this is the spoke is what he's referring to.
Black line, not, meaning this line?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah,
man,
you got it underlined and then there's one at the top. So it's part of the pattern, isn't it?
Because there's no break in it, it would never overlap. It'll just wrap
Okay.
no matter what because there's no break. In this case, you know, these, let's say we index this at 144 spokes, and then I start trying to apply this pattern, it wouldn't work. It would overlap. And when I got to the end where they wrap, they wouldn't line up and it would look goofy. That's why.
All right. Thank you.
No problem. The D-Way beading tools, like I said, easy. You'll see how they work in the video. Negative rake, they're pretty slick. So the indexing wheels, the one on the right is the chefware kits, and you can see what happens, and you'll see it in the video too. That wheel there with all the little holes in it, that sits behind the chuck on your spindle. And then the bottom part locks into your lathe bed, the ways, and it locks it in. So as you're indexing it, you can lock it in at certain degrees and it holds it in place while you score your line, or you can burn directly on the lathe too. The one on the left, you can do a homemade. So if you have some fiberboard or you have some plexiglass and a printer, you can print off your different degrees if you wanted to, affix it with some spray adhesive to that plexiglass or the backing board and make your own. So it's not like you have to go buy tools to do it. I feel like the ones on the right, those professional indexing wheels are going to give you more accuracy, but you can easily do the one on the left too. And then, so to draw those lines, you can do them. Some people will burn directly on the lathe, which I've done as well. But now for me personally, it's standing at the lathe for hours with a burn pen, and right now it's cold and all that kind of stuff. So I like to score it with a pencil and draw those index lines, and then I like to sit down in my recliner and burn them with a pen by hand. No, I would say actually burning it on the lathe is probably a little bit more accurate, but I don't like staying there for hours burning on the lathe. My first iteration of how to get those lines was I made a little jig. It was just a vertical piece of MDF board and then a little base to it. And you'll see in the video, I show a piece of it of how I was doing it. It's got a pencil hole through the middle that's lined up with the center line on the spindle, and I was indexing that way. It's definitely not accurate. You've got to worry about that jig moving around or falling off the side or flexing or anything like that. Plus finding the exact right hole size or drill size for a pencil. And have it not be sloppy. You can do it with this. I wouldn't recommend it. So my second iteration, I took my Trent Bosch stabilizing arm and I said, well, I'll just turn a little plug that fits in there and it holds a pencil. And I did that, and that does work. So if you have a stabilizing setup, you can do it. But every time you mount a piece, you've got to reset your stabilizing arm, and it's kind of a pain. And then the bottom method I found is the best. It's just a piece of wood that's mounted on a threaded pipe that fits inside your banjo, and you can set it to the exact height you want for the center line, and you can draw your pencil lines there too. So if I were going to start again from scratch, I definitely would just start off with that third iteration versus the first two. Any questions on those right now? And it may not make sense 100% until we get to the video, but
Then, Michael, you're adjusting the height of that platform so that the pencil's coming out at the center line of like you're showing on the left-hand point
Yep.
here, not on that rig there, but on the rig down on the bottom, so that your pencil line is at center point.
correct.
Okay.
And Michael, you're also then obviously looks like cutting the platform for each form shape you're gonna mark, right?
Yeah, so I like to make that vessel repetitively. So I just made a platform that matches that shape because I tend to make that one. It's a segmented piece, so it's pretty consistent. And then for a platter one, we'll see in the video, I have one that's a platform that just has a slot cut into it, so it
Cool.
fits around any size platter for the most part.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Wood burning kits. So either one, the Optima, the Razor, whatever you have, but that bottom right, that's what those wood burning pens look like. So you can get, you're going to bead in 1/8, you're going to bead in 3/16. Up to you, personal preference. A smaller piece, I would do a smaller bead. But there's two different pen styles you can get that correlate with that 1/8 or 3/16. And it just wraps right around that bead and it burns a perfect little mark. I did try, and I didn't highlight it here or talk about it at all in the video, but in the top picture with the Optima One, that burning knife style, when I first started doing these, I was using that to try and burn my vertical lines, and it works. Don't get me wrong, but it is so much easier if you just have the wood burning pen, and they're not expensive because it just perfectly wraps around that bead versus trying to maneuver your hand and get in the crevices with that razor style. And then to the questions before about the pens. So these are Faber-Castell pens. I have, I don't know, too many. And you can get them in super fine nib and then the brush nib. The super fine nib is important because when you're coloring those beads and you want to get down inside the valley, that brush will work without a doubt. But if you're trying to do two different colors and the beads are right next to each other without a really super steady hand, you're going to be scraping off color on the wrong bead every now and then. So the super fine nibs are great. In this case, I think this is sanguine color, I think. You want to get both. You want to get one of the super fine and one of the brush for doing large swaths of area. It is India ink. It's pretty color fast. I know Jason Clark uses alcohol inks instead, and he's said they're not as color fast, but he finishes his pieces with some Danish oil and it makes that color pop for him. But Faber-Castell, Dick Blick, weekendturner.com has them. Michaels has them. You can get them off Amazon. Just be careful on Amazon. Some people will charge $10 for one pen, and that's ridiculous. So then if you really want that color, go look on Faber-Castell or Dick Blick and you can order them there.
Hey, Michael.
Any questions on?
Just a quick question. When you're coloring with these pens, say one of your larger vessels, how long does a pen last if you were using one in?
Sure. I've been able to get on a large vessel, let's say I'll get a pen, or a pen will last me a vessel and a half on a large vessel, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, thanks.
I will point out, and this is kind of fun, that bottom right one, that brush tip one, you can pull that whole brush piece out, flip it over and push it back in, and you've got a brand new brush tip on it. So what tends to happen is the brush doesn't, it's not that it breaks, but that nib starts to break up and it gets kind of like a paintbrush that you've used a bunch of times, it gets kind of squirrely. So if anything, that nib will get kind of roughed up just because you're coloring raw wood before it runs out of ink. And the best way to save it is to pull that nib out, turn it around and push it back in, and you've got a fresh tip to work from. You can't do that with the super fine ones though, but the brush nibs, absolutely. And then I think you guys have seen before in the archival sprays, I've used the matte, the semi-gloss, and the gloss. I like them all. It just depends on the piece that I'm making. But it actually seals that ink in and it protects it. So even though that ink is pretty color fast, if somebody's going to be handling your piece a lot and you haven't put a finish on it, they can rub off the color. It'll stay in the grain, but they can rub off the top layer. So definitely put a finish on it. I like that archival spray because none of the ink runs and it gives it a real clean finish.
How many coats do you put on, Michael?
I typically one, yeah, I don't go
Nice.
crazy on it, but
Nice.
I've noticed a big difference. That first platter I showed you guys that had the spiral pattern, I never put a finish on that one, and it's been handled a bunch, and you can definitely see where the color has been rubbed off. So after I learned from that, I put a finish on all of them now, so it protects that color. That's it. That was the presentation side. Hope I didn't put anybody to sleep. Anybody have any questions on what we just went through?
Yeah, Michael, on your burning, the kind of a bead shaped pen
Yeah.
burning tip. Are you using a real low heat just to get wood compression, or are you actually burning a dark line on
I-
tips of that?
So That's a great point, because when I first started and I first got my wood burner, I didn't, it wasn't set properly from the manufacturer, and it was on super high heat, and I didn't know any better because I'd never really worked with a burning setup before, and it was just scorching everything. Once I figured out how to dial it into the right, now I keep it pretty low, so it is burning, but it's not, there's very minimal smoke coming off, if that gives you a point of comparison. I just really want to score that line and give it some darkness. I'm not trying to burn deep into the wood.
Have you tried for an incision like a wood carver's V tool?
I have not.
That might be
So-
pretty labor intensive.
Yeah, those wood burning pens, I don't know, a point of reference, it's hard because that Optima, I put it on like a level 5, but that 5 could be different for different people based on how they have theirs tuned. But it's enough to score a clean line and give it a good definition. If that gets up too high, then all of a sudden it looks muddy because every line is scorched and it tends to yellow the wood next to it as it burns. So I try to do as low as heat possible, but yet still produce a burn line on it. All right, I'm going to share the video. And I'm sorry, was there any other questions on any of that before we start? Nope, okay.
So if people have questions on the video, Michael stopped this at three points during the video. So if you can save your questions, you can put them in the chat or just save them till the breaks in the video.
Yep.
Michael, there was one other question on the chat, and I'm not really sure I understand what it is. Laurent Mezen put the question up, 13 by 10 question mark. So Laurent, if you can maybe help us understand your question.
Yeah, that was referring to the question about the number of beads and to repeat the pattern.
I got you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
The 10 left to right, 13 up and down.
Okay. Okay. Very good.
Makes sense.
Yep.
Okay. And I'm going to narrate a little bit, but I'm going to try not to talk through the whole thing. I'm going to put it on mute because it's just background noise in the shop, which can be kind of annoying, especially when I fast forward. So I didn't go through the whole process of how to turn a platter. Most of you gentlemen know how to turn a platter. And I'm just getting into the beading process here. So this is going to be when you're turning a platter, for example, you're going to turn the back side of the platter first, obviously, and you're going to want to beat it before you flip it because that headstock's going to be in the way. You wouldn't really be able to bead the back side once you have it mounted properly. I'm a big fan of doing waste blocks for my tenons. That's just what I do, and it's largely because I don't want to waste some of the good wood. So that's why you won't really see a tenon here. I'll be gluing a waste block on here in a minute. So on the beading side, what I'm doing is I'm scoring the lines first. I'm not necessarily turning full beads, and I just want to set those parameters and those valleys so that when I go to turn the full bead, that the tool doesn't slide. I don't mess up the bead next to it, because the worst that could happen is I turn a bunch of beads and I get to this one that doesn't have a line for me to start at, and all of a sudden the tool grabs and I've destroyed 4 of the beads that I did previously, if that makes sense. The finish of the piece before you start beading, it doesn't matter. Don't bother sanding. Don't bother trying to get a perfect finish on that, because you're just going to beat it anyways. Really, it's just kissing it to the what do you call it? The sharpener, and you're good to go. So once I have those lines laid out, then I'm going to actually start turning real beads. And if you pay attention to the angle of approach on that beading tool, it's a very strong negative angle. I'm working back and forth trying to establish the parameters of that bead and get that roundness. And then as I get deeper into it and it starts really forming the bead, I'll start moving the tool to where it's more of a scraping motion, and not as much as a negative rake. And I found that just gives me the best finish and the best definition of the beads. I still have not mastered it, so I'll look at it after I turn the whole section, and I'll get my magnifiers, and I think it looks great. But then when I go to color, I realize I had a couple flat tops on beads that I didn't catch. So that's something I'm working on trying to get better at. I do use these tools without a handle. They do make handles that come with them, but it's just easier to get into and maneuver into spaces without the big handle on the bottom. There's not a lot of torque on them. It's a pretty easy tool to use. And oddly enough, I think going and fast forward, you get to see the process better, just because of the repeatability. Plus, it gets boring watching beads getting turned at regular speed.
Michael, what's your RPM on the lathe when you're doing the beads?
Anywhere between two to 2,500. See right here, I notice I've got a couple flat tops. So I have to go back, and what I found is I'll sharpen and I'll speed up the lathe. So if I'm at 2, I'll go to 2,500. And what I don't show here, but usually, so, I'll do my indents, I'll do the general bead, and then I'll actually go back and sharpen and then do a final on all the beads. You can still see there's some tear on them. They're not going to be perfect. But once you put a pattern on, it doesn't matter. This is a piece of countertop sample that you can get from Home Depot or Lowe's if you wanted Formica countertops. And this stuff works great for actually burning in between the beads. On a vessel, you could use wire, obviously, but as that diameter curves, you got to figure out something to get into those areas, and that Formica seems to work really well. I've also cut really thin strips of maple on the table saw and use those to burn in the lines in between the beads. Now, something, even though, it may say, well, it's boring to show me gluing on a wood block, but I think the important thing here is on that wood block is it helps me get that piece further away from the headstock too. So I'm going to have to be doing some work back there when I index the lathe, or when I index the piece, and draw my index lines. So using a waste block and making it, we'll call it, a little bit more deeper than normal, it helps get that piece away from that headstock so you can work back there when you're drawing your lines. Any questions on that first piece?
So just a question on the waste block there, Michael. So I guess the con or the downfall to that is that you have to wait for that glue to set up right before you can turn around and continue with your piece. Yeah,
that's true. You could use hot glue. You could use 5-minute epoxy. I tend to just use the wood glue, the Type Bond 3, and I'm obviously not in a rush on these pieces.
So you let that set overnight then, and you're good from there?
Yeah,
Or
I've let
how
it
long?
set for a couple of hours before and then
Oh.
turned.
Oh, wow.
It actually sets up pretty quickly, but for the most part, yes, I'll go on and do something else and let it sit overnight, and then I'll get back out in the shop in the morning. But the 5-minute epoxy, I've turned within 15 minutes. The hot glue immediately after it dries a little bit. I tend to not be in a rush, I guess.
Yeah. Good.
Anybody else have any questions on that first part? Okay. So the second part, we're going to flip it around, obviously, and do the face of the platter. You understand, obviously, why we beaded the backside. Again, finish isn't important because you're beating it anyways, and you're going to get some tear out, especially if it's super dry. What I'm really focusing on here is establishing that bead from that bottom part and then wrapping it around the top so it's seamless. So that's the very first thing I want to work on once I flip that around, is making sure that that bead meets up with the front side and it's seamless. And when you're beading, just like turning a regular platter, you know, once you turn your outside to final thickness, um, you do that on the outside first because of the flex, especially on a larger diameter piece. That's even more so important here. So I'm only turning away a couple inches, 3-4 inches at a time, doing my beading, and then turning off more of the center, because once we start getting that flex and that warp on the outside diameter, you're not going to get a clean bead. And then I'll show you here in a second another trick that I picked up with stabilizing the piece. So it's a leather glove. It's just an Ace Hardware glove. The leather part's important. I don't fully put it on my hand because I am pressing against the back of the piece, but it's enough so that I can press firmly on the back of the piece while I'm creating that bead, and it minimizes the flex on the outer diameter of that platter. And then I literally on that part, I rinse and repeat and work in sections starting from the outside going in. Again, just establishing my lines so I don't have the tool slip and destroy a bunch of beads. Once I get those lines established, I sharpen, I go back in, I start establishing the bead to the final shape, and then I'll typically sharpen one more time and then do a finishing cut or a last finish on the beads before I move on. When you get towards the inner diameter, I won't turn that last row. I won't turn that as a full bead. I'll just leave the indent because I need to know what height for the thickness as I continue on taking out more of the middle section.
Michael, on your tool rest height, when you're cutting those beads, are you right at center?
Yeah, I'm just at center and sometimes just a little bit above center.
Okay.
If you notice, I do this weird thing with my pinky that directs my tools. I don't know why, so you guys can make fun of me later.
Thought you were drinking tea.
I'm a fancy turner. Again, with the glove, just help stabilize it. Once I get towards the center and the meat of that platter is really on that waist block, it's not nearly as big of a deal. But on the outside diameter, just that little bit of flex, you'll get some really odd shaped beads or a flat bead on one side of the platter, but it's a nice curved bead on the other side of the platter. So using that glove trick has helped a lot.
You'd use a piece of that sanding material that you use, Michael, and then you do two things in one go.
There you go. Yeah. That sanding material from Cling Sports, it's great, but if you hold it in one place for too long, it does melt. And then something else, because we're going to get past this here in a second. When I use that Formica, those samples that are graciously donated by Lowe's for their sample section, those, if you don't put it straight into that bead cavern, if you will, the valley, you will burnish the outside of the bead or the inside of the other bead, which are where you're going to look at it. So something that I have a tendency to do that I always regret later is I'll burn it. I may not notice at the time. And then when I'm sitting down to color, I realize that there's a lot of burn inside of one of the valleys and it's going up the side of the bead. So something to keep in mind when you're making the piece. I have learned that if I catch it, I'll go back in with my beading tool before I take it off the lathe, and I'll turn it away real quick and then reburn it.
So are you
Is that
saying,
burn?
don't overburn?
Yeah, because if you're not going in dead straight into the valley of that bead and you're off at an angle with that Formica stuff, it'll burnish the side
see.
and part of the top of the bead.
I see.
And-
You gotta,
And then when you're looking at it,
straight in. Okay.
yeah. And then when you're looking at it from a distance, what you'll see is some really clean burn lines, and all of a sudden one just looks really super thick. It's not even. So just a heads up when you're burning those lines to try and get into that valley dead straight.
Is that burn in the valley absolutely necessary?
No, you could do it with a pen. I mean, you don't have to burn it like that. I've actually burned it and then sat down to color and realized that it didn't burn as good in some areas. And I'll just use a fine tip black and go in there and color in the valley with the black. It just helps set that it helps set the definition though, for each of those beads.
Hey, Mike, have you found if some of those cards are different thicknesses? Seem like you'd want the thinnest one you could get.
You do. I have not, in the sample section that I borrowed, I did not see any difference in variation in thicknesses, but yeah, if you can find, I'd get the thinnest possible.
Okay.
And there's that Cling Spores, the sanding pads I have, the gray, the maroon, and the yellow or the white. Because if you really try to sand these beads, you're going to get flat tops. And you can see on this, guys, there's some tear on there. It's inevitable because you're really not putting a fine finish on it. And it just becomes, it's not perfect. If you can get a great bead, awesome. But it becomes irrelevant once you start coloring it. You don't even see it.
Michael, we do a lot of laminate work at my job.
Mhm.
I can get you as much thin laminate as you want.
Oh, you'd be my best friend. Okay, that was the fun part. That was the actual at the lathe part. The rest is just downhill from here, guys. Any questions on the process, on how to stabilize it while you're turning those beads, or how to burn them?
Can you put a knife edge on that laminate sanding application?
Yeah, I don't
Does
see
it
why
help?
not. I've taken those thin pieces of maple that I've cut on the table saw, and I've taken them to the sander with the block behind it and just tried to make them a little bit thinner. I don't know if it would gum up your sandpaper though. I really don't know. I also saw a video where somebody used some sandpaper from Cling Spores, but it was a hard-backed sandpaper, and they used that to burn their lines. And I can't quite figure out what sandpaper they used, but they came out pretty clean. So that might be an area to explore. You guys have some hardback sandpaper, just something to get in between. I've actually, oh, here's another one too. I used index cards too. So I've taken index cards and I've used those to burn lines. I found that Formica works better though. Nothing works as good as really thin piece of maple, in my opinion.
Have you tried using a wire and a loop?
I have on the vessels. The problem with the vessel is as you get closer towards the smaller diameter, you obviously can't get that wire to stay within there. But on the widest diameter of a vessel, that wire on a loop is the best.
I meant on a hard wire on a very small loop for burning your circumferential line.
Oh,
not
no.
the-
No, I haven't thought of that. That's interesting.
Michael, I have heard, and when using Formica, I mean, in one of the forums that, Formica is a phenolic resin and you're now vaporizing it when you're doing this, that there was concern over some, health issues with the vapors from that. So I don't know enough about it to know one way or the other, but again, it is a resin and you are burning it and it does produce when I've done it, it does produce some smoke. So probably at the very minimum, good ventilation and a respirator.
Yeah.
I'm not, and again, I'm not positive, but it would make sense that it's probably not good for you in large doses.
I agree. I usually try to open the shop door and I turn on the what do you call it, the dust collector right behind the piece, because it doesn't smell good. I'll tell you that.
Well, yeah,
Gentlemen, it's not so much the phenolic that scares me. It's the fact that it's polymerized with formaldehyde and that's coming out in the smoke. That's some nasty stuff. So yeah, good ventilation is dictated.
I still prefer a thin piece of maple. If I can get it cut thin enough on the table saw, I'll try to use that 9 times out of 10. Any other questions on that? All right, so here's the fun part. And if you guys are paying attention, I think I'm wearing 9 different shirts throughout this whole video. So that's that indexing wheel that I was talking about. Mounts onto the spindle. The chuck, just the friction, fit between the chuck and the spindle holds it in place. You don't have to get crazy and tighten it too much or anything like that. And then that post has a spring-loaded pin on it. And in this case, I'm going to index at 120 lines. So I'm lining it up with the holes that represent 120 line index on the backside. You can't see it. This is the first iteration I was talking about. I just took a piece of that MDF and put a little piece in it so it would sit inside the lathe. Typically would take a clamp and hold it on the backside so it doesn't move. And then this is coming up here in a second, my jig that I created with the pencil. It works. I wouldn't say it's the best, but it definitely works. The problem is that if that center line changes from any micronic reason or whatever, or the pencil, you run out of lead and you have to change pencils and that lead's slightly off, it's not accurate. Where this is, it's basically just a threaded pipe with that receiver. You set it at your height, fits right in the banjo, and then you can adjust accordingly. And so if I'm using a different pencil than I used last time and the lead's off center, or it's a different thickness pencil or whatever the case is. And then what I do is I pull my tailstock up and I'll place the pencil on there and make sure that I'm lined up with dead center.
So
This
Michael,
process, yeah.
yeah, maybe you can pause for a second here. Yeah, I think someone had a question.
Okay. I think we're doing good on time.
Oh, I guess I thought I heard somebody say one question, but I have just a point that I'll make is that I made one of these platforms not for the purpose of basket illusion, but for another purpose this past week. And I had a tool rest support, right? That you can change the support on the top of the post, so it has like a screw thread that goes into it. So I just took that and I got a bolt and a washer that fit that, and I just drilled a hole through the platform that you show here, and then put that bolt through it and tightened it down. And then I can adjust it, to the height that I need depending on whatever purpose I'm going to use it for. So I just wanted to highlight that as another option if you don't have if you have one of those or something, instead of having to get a pipe and so forth and do that, you can do it that way as well if you have one of those posts. And then a question for you is, what size pipe is that?
So, it's actually a piece that I got from chefware kits, but it's not, they're selling it as a kit. It's relatively inexpensive, but if anybody's versed in the plumbing industry, which ironically, my buddy owns a plumbing company, it's just threaded pipe. So if you know somebody that can get them for you, it's probably cheaper than what I bought from Chefware kits, but it's a 1-inch diameter for the same as my banjo. And it's threaded on one side of it. And then the receiving end is just a flange that plumbers will use to hold pipes in place, the bracket, or a floor flange.
Yep.
And I bought additional flanges. So all I do is unscrew the pipe from one of my platforms and screw it into the other one and set my height on the next one based on what shape I'm indexing.
Okay. So it must
It
be like,
wasn't expensive.
it must be like 3/4 inch, like galvanized pipe you got there, because that'd be about an inch. I didn't realize it was an inch on the outside, but it must be an
Yeah,
inch on the outside diameter, 3/4 on the inside diameter.
yeah, it's a good fit. So it is definitely a 1-inch OD.
Okay.
I bought a 1-inch by 8 thread bolt at one of the stores here in town for $8. And you can buy nuts to go with it. Works like a charm too.
Yeah, perfect.
Oh,
You know, that platform, the other thing is give yourself
Asinine, I
plenty
think
of
it
room.
was.
The other thing on the platform side, give yourself plenty of room. Don't cut a little tiny platform because you're going to be sliding that pencil back and forth. And if it's short on the backside and the pencil's a long pencil, you don't want it to, it's not that it's going to come off and fall on the floor, but you just want accurate lines. So you don't want to disturb the plane of that pencil sliding on that surface.
Have you thought about using a cradle on a Dremel tool with a flame tip burr to cut your horizontal lines?
I have seen some people that have done that, or they've embedded their burn pen into a block of wood that's obviously flat, and they're burning on the lathe, which is ideal. I like to sit in the recliner and do it.
Well, I'm a relative beginner with this, so I'm still working on a MIDI lathe. I only have a 5/8 inch tool rest post. So
Yeah,
working with a flame tip on a smaller diameter might be the way for me to go.
absolutely. So that took about 30 minutes. The first time I did it, it took forever because I just was clumsy with it. Now I can knock them out pretty quickly. It's just a repetitive motion. It locks into place, draw a line, move it, lock into place, draw a line, no big deal. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and take off that. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll leave it on the waste block and I'll just remove it from the chuck, and then I'll go burn my lines, and then I'll take it back to the chuck, put it in, and then sand it with a sanding disc real quick just to clean up the burn lines. In this case, I didn't. I just went ahead and removed it straight from that waste block, and I'm just going to clean up the bottom on it, and then I'll get into burning. Probably could have cut this out. You guys have seen what it looks like to take a waste block off and do the bottom of a plotter before. But then you get to see my little fancy pinky action.
Yeah, so question here on this bottom here, and then on the center, on the inside as well, do you have, like you were talking before, the lines, the beads get too small, or whatever you call the little section pieces, right? So do you
Yep.
have like don't go down below a 3-inch or 4-inch or whatever recommendation?
No, I played that first one I turned that I showed in the beginning that has the spirals. I went all the way down to dead center with beads, and it looks okay. I wouldn't try and color the beads towards the center in individual colors. I just made them solid black, solid red, solid
Yeah,
black.
okay. Okay, gotcha. So it's more of, in this case, it's more of the look that you were after on the inside, to have a little blank space, you might say, or whatever, right? Accent.
Yep, exactly. So that's the wood burning setup. There's Grace on the right. This used to be my son's room for about 16 years, so you'll see all the stains on the carpet because he was a teenage boy, and I haven't got around to recarpeting it, so don't judge me. And I don't do this all at one time. I'll sit down, I've got Netflix going and I'm watching a documentary or something, or I'm listening to it. I've got the magnifiers on and I'll burn some lines and start watching, a little bit of the show and then maybe burn some more lines. So I'm never in a rush to get these done. I just take what it takes, and it's usually a couple of days worth of time working on it periodically throughout each day.
Yeah, I can see from the motion that you're doing now that push motion is much better than the dragging down
Yeah.
low and across the top and then down low again.
That's the way I first tried it, and then keeping that blade straight so you don't go off path was just, I didn't get really clean lines. These wood burning pens are much better, and you can see that that tip is actually angled slightly, so you can get a vertical look on where you're about to put the burn pen versus having it perfectly horizontal.
Yeah, I did not have a concept until now that you were doing a stab cut. I thought you were doing a drag cut.
And then so what I'll do, I'm going to pause here real quick. So what I'll do, that's the fine nib on those Faber-Castell pens. I've already picked out my pattern. I've drawn it out on paper. And what I'm doing is transferring the concept from the paper that I planned out to the piece. And what happens is I'll start doing this, and what I'm doing is I'm counting. So I know that this lotus pattern, if you look at we'll call it dead center screen, I know it's going to be 3 colored, and then 11, and then 3, and then I'm going to skip 3, and then 3, and then 11. But I figured that out on paper first. So I don't mean that to sound as confusing as it is. I'm just looking at what I did on the paper and transferring it. But I'm just going to put little beads to make sure that it's the triple check of my math. So I don't jump right in and start coloring beads. I just do a little mark and make sure that I'll go all the way around, make sure it lines up. That establishes my baseline. Once I know I didn't screw up my math and that the pattern is going to be perfectly on the repeat side, then I'll start going back in coloring. If you're like me, I get halfway through and I have to second guess and go back and recount again. It's like locking your front door, getting halfway down the street and then going, did I really lock the front door?
Yeah, I was just getting ready to say the same thing. I probably would be recounting all the time.
But once you get that first line, like now I've established here that this is my pattern and it lines up, I'm good. Now I can just go hog wild.
Hog wild at this scale is a relative term.
Now I can get it done in 20 hours instead of 40. How do you like that? So on the smaller beads, obviously, that fine nip is really important. What I did here was I faked making mistakes so we can see what you do if you make a mistake. Let's say I realize I shouldn't have colored that one. This is just an X-Acto knife that I got off of Amazon. You can use a scalpel and you're just going to scrape it and you can scrape that ink off. It takes a little bit of effort. So this isn't something you want to do if you get halfway through the piece and then realize you messed up half the pattern. You're probably just going to say, forget it at that point. But if you catch it early on, just scrape it off and it's good to go.
Do you know if
Maybe
there's
another
any
reason to keep
effective,
the waste block on so you can go back and recut the bead.
Yep, exactly.
do you know if there's any effective bleach for that ink?
Not that I've seen, and I haven't heard. So again, I'm just laying out that pattern. It's like a rinse and repeat. I'm just drawing little dots. And once you get in the rhythm, I know it's one up, one over, one up, one over, one up, one over.
No, I cannot see doing that in front of the TV.
Yeah, that part I do in front of the TV actually, but I had to do it at the desk here so I could actually set the camera up and you could see what I was doing. And then I switch, once I get past the little tiny beads, I'll switch over to the brush nib because you can just cover a lot more surface area quickly. And on this pattern, I know that from the tip of that smaller one on the lotus pattern, I'm going to go up 6 spaces and then start working backwards. So, because it's going to be an overlapping leaf pattern. So that's what you'll see me doing, counting upwards from that smaller leaf. And these patterns, they're not super complex, but I mean, you can make some really cool stuff out of simple, you know, what do you call it? Patterns like pixel style patterns or whatnot. Doesn't have to be complex. And compared to what I've seen other people produce, this isn't complex, but it's probably not the pattern I'd start with. So that's me, you know, a good portion of the way through. Now I've finished the front. Working on the back now. And then I decided to make it different. So I changed it up and did a different pattern around the outer rim. And there's the finished piece. So that's the same pattern as that fall vessel, but without any color to give it depth. That's it. You see, it's easy. You can do it in 40 minutes. It's no big deal.
Yeah, right.
Any questions? If not, this will be one of our fastest demos ever. So load it up.
How long have you been doing this?
6 months now.
Pretty amazing quality work.
Thank you. Honestly, anybody can do it. It's not like there's a special talent or gift. It's just, if you have the time, I know you can do it. And the time actually it goes quicker than you think, especially sitting in the chair doing woodworking.
I was going to make one comment, which is more of one of Alan's patented artistic comments. The platter that you showed that was half autumn and half green.
That pattern.
One of the early slides as your practice pattern, that struck me as being spring and fall. So if you made that in quarters of that platter and chose 2 other colors that might represent, you know, summer and winter.
I like that.
Be kind of cool.
Yeah. That's a good idea. Because I could break it into quarters. Yeah. I like it.
Good.
Michael, do you have any place in particular that you're going to find patterns? I mean, is it out on the internet that you're just searching, or?
Yeah. So what I started doing was looking for cross stitch patterns, and you can see what people come up with. And then I looked for pixel patterns. So if you just search pixel patterns, you'll come up with people who are doing stuff like for Minecraft or whatever. But if you sort through those Google images, you can start picking out like, oh, that's a good idea if I incorporate this. So I get a lot of those inspirations from looking at either pixel patterns or cross stitch patterns.
Perfect. That's a great idea. Yeah.
And then the other one, so this is called a Navajo wedding basket. And my dad is really big into Native American history. So this is actually, I hope he doesn't see this video. This is actually his Christmas present. So you can just look up Native American basket designs too. You'll see what they've done historically, and then you can incorporate some of that into the work and come up with your own patterns.
Michael, it's interesting. My wife is a quilter, and there are all kinds of patterns that they do for quilting, and it strikes me that even if you look at some of those type of quilting patterns, you might get inspired to do something that's like that.
I agree. There's like here's my, so I was working on this one and I'm trying to figure out how to make it more depth, but that came from a search online. I saw something similar and that gave me some ideas. The quilting is a great idea. Back towards, what do you call it? Halloween, I was trying to come up with a spider pattern. So, I mean, honestly, if you're just sitting around and you got some colored pencils and some paper, just start playing with patterns. I've surprised myself a few times.
Michael, have you tried something like SketchUp for stretching those polar patterns down the sides of your vessels?
I haven't tried the SketchUp. It's called, I think it's called Basket Illusion Software. It's made by the same company that does the segment software so that you can design segmented pieces. And like I said, I think it's only like 15 bucks. I'm sure it works. I'm just not smart enough yet to figure it out. I couldn't get it to do the pattern. So I knew that I was using a piece with 120 spokes, let's say, and I loaded in, or I colored a pattern in their software that should have worked. And then when I say render to show it on the vessel that I chose, it was off. So I must have a setting wrong in that application, but there is one out there. It's relatively inexpensive, and it'll show you what your pattern will look like on a finished piece. You can design your vessel, you can upload a vessel. They have a library, so it's a base, or it's going to be a platter, or it's going to be something like one of the other vessels that I showed.
Michael, can you speak to the application of the segmented turning and a couple things specifically? So on your horizontal lines, do you try to make those match on the joints in the segments, or is that an issue? And then also even on the vertical, or on your spokes, is it important that do you adjust your number of segments in a ring to align with spokes, or so it works out that they fall on spokes? Because I would think that it would tend to, if you have a cell that has a joint in it, that could change the way that either the ink takes up on it, or even the way the groove cuts. But I mean, I understand that why you want to use segmenting, obviously, in order to get the shapes. But how does that influence your design?
So full disclosure, I'm probably not smart enough to figure out the math to make sure that my index lines would line up on a joint. I have seen, to your point, where as I'm indexing it, there are times where inadvertently that index line goes right down the line of one of the joints. But I'm also offsetting the joints every ring. So they don't all perfectly, you don't have a straight joint line down the whole piece. It's always offset by a quarter turn. So inadvertently, there always will be an index line that ends up on a joint line. The only thing I've seen, and I think you pointed out one time when we were talking, is when I burn that section, it smokes more, but it's probably because it's burning the glue and not the wood. And I have seen that when I'm coloring a bead that has a joint line in it, it'll be slightly different color, but your eye is never, I've never had it drawn to it. When you're looking at the pieces as a whole, even up close, I think recognizing that it's a slight, shade different on that. I've never had anybody point it out, and I tend not to see it when I do it, but yeah, it does affect it.
So along those same lines, if you were to do one of those hollow forms and you didn't do it segmented, so the advantage, I guess, doing segmented is it's all side grain, versus if you did it just on a solid piece of wood, you'd have some end grain and side grain, and I imagine that the ink reacts very differently to end grain than it does to side grain. Is it?
It does, and so the end grain sucks up the ink, obviously, and that end grain, because you're not really sanding the piece and it's not a real tight finishing cut with the beading tools, the end grain will tear up the tips on your pens pretty quickly. So I started doing the segmenting because I didn't want to use a piece of green wood that I'd have to wait to dry, and then it's going to warp, and then my beads are going to look off center, which could be actually kind of cool from an artistic standpoint. It could look more natural, like a basket, but I wanted something that I can control all the variables, and trying to find a 14 and a half diameter piece of wood by 9.5 inches thick that I could turn into a vessel and then bead was next to impossible. So I just started doing the segmenting pieces.
Okay. Yeah, it seems to make a lot of sense, and possibly solve some problems. as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Michael, if I may add one other bizarre comment. It struck
Yeah.
me that, thank you. It struck me that a lot of people have made segmented bowls of different kinds of wood and with very interlocking patterns and whatever. What if you were to simulate that with your technique, and perhaps the top and bottom of a platter would look like a segmented bowl of different kinds of wood, but they don't necessarily match top and bottom, which has its own interesting
Yeah.
thing. But from the top
Yeah.
or bottom view, it would look like a segmented bowl. And it's like, how do you do that? Okay,
Yeah,
idea number
you can do
2.
that.
Enjoy.
Yeah, I think that would work. You just make larger indexed pieces to represent like a segment, and then color it, red or whatever, or
Yeah, the
purple
block,
heart
it'd
color.
just be bigger blocks that might be, like
Yep.
8, 6
Yeah.
by 8 and different lengths and widths and whatever. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Picture got popped into my mind.
No, that's a cool idea.
Hey, Michael, just a quick question on the wood preparation before you color. Is there any medium you ever apply before you do the inks to get a different consistency or a better consistency or anything?
I have not, but I've been thinking lately, because on some of those, like this piece, this one, in order to get those colors to pop, I had to actually do two applications of the dye to each bead. So that's why that piece took so long. After the first go around, it looked cool, but those colors weren't popping. They just weren't bright. So I went back through and colored each of them again. So I started thinking, what if I put some sanding sealer on it prior to? Would that help so that the ink wouldn't fully get, absorbed into the wood? And I don't know. I haven't tried it yet. I'm kind of nervous to try it because I'm afraid that I put sanding sealer on it and then go to color it, what if it doesn't absorb any of the ink? And now I've just got a piece that I've wasted all that time on.
Make a small
Very true.
sample.
Yeah.
Just
Well, I
do
thought about it after I
just
made
do
a big
little
one.
test piece. It could even be a flat piece.
Yeah. Agreed. But that's a good point. I don't know. I would like to figure that out though, because if I can avoid having to color each bead twice, that would be a huge time saver for a piece like that.
Do you, for the wood, I didn't hear you mention any particular wood that you like to make. I'll call it the
So
bowl or platter or whatever.
yeah, maple to me is it's the go-to, I think, because it's such a neutral base to work from. And even variations, you might get a little bit of a darker piece of maple, or it may have a grain line in there a little bit, but it's so minimal it doesn't impact the piece. I just made a piece, it's downstairs. I just made a gift for my mother for Christmas, and it was Bradford pear, and it had a bunch of grain coloration in there, and it really showed through on the final piece, even after I colored it all. But it looks cool. I mean, it looks unique for that piece, but I wouldn't want it on a big vessel. That would be annoying, I think.
You using hard or soft maple?
Hard maple. I would love to say, well, I do it because this. I don't know. Soft maple may be just as good.
I was just thinking, Michael, how about, on the beads, try burnishing those beads, to help close up those ends. Sealer is a good idea, but also it would smooth it out, that end grained pieces, or
Yeah.
where you have tear out, it would help, instead of sanding it down, right, you're burnishing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't tried that. Actually, that's a good idea because I got plenty of shavings laying around afterwards.
Yeah, that's what I've done that with some of the napkin rings that I've done, and it really has made a big difference to it. So you might give that a go and see if
That'll
it
be this
helps.
weekend project. That's a good idea.
Have you ever tried to add more hours into the whole work by texturing individual beads or anything?
No, but that's a good idea too. Somebody actually told me yesterday, hey, have you thought about doing gold leaf on some beads? And I was like, no, I hadn't thought of that either. That'd be kind of
That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're just trying to make this take 120 hours, aren't you?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. You don't have enough time in it already. You're gonna add some more.
That, I don't, guys, honestly, and I think it's not discouraging to me by any stretch of imagination. I don't want it to discourage somebody else where they go, oh, I've got 70 hours. And well, that's because I segmented it and I did this and I recolored each bead twice, and it doesn't need to be that way. I mean, honestly, this thing I made for my dad, it was a solid piece of maple. I turned the platter probably in 35 minutes, max. The beading process was super fast, indexed it real quick. I probably have maybe 4 to 5 hours in this, which is a lot more than if I just turned a regular platter, I understand. But it's not like it took me weeks and weeks to make something that he's gonna love,
Yeah, I heard one other comment from a person. I can't remember who it was. It may have been Harvey Meyer, I don't know how you pronounce his name, but it may have been him. But he said that he retired and he started turning pieces and the house was getting filled up. And his
Yeah.
wife said, you got to do something with this stuff. It's too much, because he was turning half a dozen or more pieces a day, And so that's how he got started with Basket Illusions, was to, create a little bit more finer or interesting pieces and less pieces, right? But still get all the enjoyment out of, creating something, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, he didn't have to be in the shop all the time. He could
No.
do some of that someplace else.
To me, it's a challenge, and like I said, I assume most of these guys in general are really into a challenge. So it's a fun challenge and it's rewarding. And I did a market a couple weekends ago. And I got to tell you, not many people want to buy the Basket Illusion pieces because of the price point, because the hours you have into it. Not that I'm trying to be crazy in my pricing, but you can't charge yourself $10 an hour for your time. That's just silly. So, it's not like it's a huge seller at a market. It may be at an art event, but at a market, probably not. But it definitely brought people into the booth. And I met a lot of actually, Laurent. That's how I met Laurent. It's a great thing to either start a conversation, or somebody sees it, they're interested, and they end up buying something else. Even if it's not about sales, it did bring a lot of people in just to have a conversation of, oh, how'd you do that? So I got to meet some really cool people through that process too.
I'd like to comment that Warren just posted a chat entry about putting some, actual beads or something like that into like a groove. And that occurred to me about 5 or 10 minutes ago. Cut a groove around the rim and put some actual beads in there or something like that. And,
yeah. And then what was his name? Sorry, I'm drawing a blank. That we just had the demo on.
Scott Grove.
Scott, yeah. So turning that valley, I think, not a valley in the bead, but turning that in there, inserting turquoise, and then doing a UV resin to seal it. That would be pretty cool. That's a good idea, Laurent.
Or anything else like that. I mean, you could put a wire wrap in there, like a copper, silver, whatever, a couple of layers of that as an ornamentation. But anything that just wraps around it and draws your eye to it, a little contrast.
And I've seen some people do.
Oh, and I'm sorry, one other thing. You're talking about prepping the surface so the inks don't soak in. I think you should make some smaller samples with all kinds of different preps. Maybe a varnish spray or shellac or something like that, and see what works. Anything that the paint would sit on and stay on, before you put the Krylon over the top to nail it down. But just try a bunch of things there. Yeah,
I need to. It's all been a big experiment. I did want to say, I've seen some people that have turned funnels, and it was intentional. I'm not saying it was accidental, but they turned funnels, and then they did the centerpiece of the illusion as a dream catcher. So they ran string through it, and that was kind of a cool accent they did on a basket illusion platter type thing. And I did think about doing a pendant with the basket illusion, but then a precious stone on the inside. I think like a piece of turquoise or something, that would be pretty cool too.
Don't hate me for this, Michael, but I'm thinking about a pierced vessel.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
That'd be cool. That's what I mean. I feel like don't get me wrong, I don't get bored turning a burl, or I don't get bored turning whatever, if I'm doing a resin piece or whatever. It opened up a whole bunch of new possibilities and different design applications. And hopefully, I tend to jump from one, like, oh, I'm going to turn some skateboards this month, and the next month I'm into resin, and the month after that I'm into burls. I have yet to get bored of coming up with different basket illusion patterns.
I think together we've just added a whole bunch of branches to that possible product line here, and for any of us. That's great.
Yeah.
Good springboard.
Yeah, your
Thank
one
you.
line item on inspiration, I think is working, Michael.
Good.
Yes.
So full transparency. How many of you people would actually try this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Anybody inspired to give it a try?
Yeah, definitely.
Good.
I actually bought the sorbet
me too.
tools a few weeks
Did you?
ago, tried them, and I didn't like them and sent them back, contemplating the D-Way because it was really interesting to me to try. So that's probably the route I'll go.
The D-Ways are much better.
I just picked up a pair and I'm getting ready to experiment with them. I haven't tried them yet.
I mean, even if you just, like that one example that I threw together, even if you just did a couple of beads around the outside of a piece and then a little pattern, it's a differentiator. All of a sudden people go, oh, what's that? Versus, oh, you turned a bowl. I can get a bowl at TJ Maxx for $12. Nobody can get what you do if you come up with a pattern that's simple. It's definitely a differentiator.
You're going to make me way overstep my skill set.
Nah.
Michael, I missed one thing early in the game, or you might have mentioned or whatever. The beading width, how wide is that beading tool from point to point?
So they have a 1/8 or a 3/16.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And
Like
you
you
use
were
the
gonna
1/8
maybe-
mostly, right?
Mickey, you're
What's
gonna try to get a discount for bulk order. I'd be interested in going in on that.
Yeah, if you guys want to, so if you want to look me up on the website and shoot me an email or hit me up on Instagram, and let me know if you want to, because they will do. I said, hey, could you guys just give us a discount code? But I understand why they don't want to release a code. So they said, look, we'll do a bulk order. So if enough people want to get into the D-Way tools, just let me know and I'll put together. And that's what it looks like. I forgot I had one sitting on my desk. And I'll put together. I think it's like we get like 10% off is what it is. I already have mine. I don't need any, but maybe I'll buy a couple more for for fun of it.
So
I hope you guys try it. I won't be
just-
offended if you don't, but I hope you do.
just a reminder, so at our January show and tell will be the opportunity, anybody tries it between now and then, just to, try it on a small scale, or, if you do try it and either have questions or it's just partially done or anything, if you try it, certainly, submit the piece you did, finished or not, and for our January show and tell, we'll have a little bit more critique on it.
Awesome. And then honestly, guys, like I said, I'm not an expert in anything, but reach out to me, social media or email, and I am happy to help any way I can, if I can be of any value.
Michael, you talked about using the India ink markers. That's just for black, right?
No, they're actually all, according to, I won't pretend to be an expert in this either. So these are the Faber-Castells, and according to their site, they're all India ink.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yep. And then obviously the B on the side indicates it's a brush tip. There's some that have an S or the actual millimeters it is. I don't have any in front of me on the side. And the colors, once you get into the fine tips, the color choices really start to get low. So don't be depressed if you're like, hey, I really want to do something that's this color and they don't have it in super fine tip. I just make do with the brush tip, and I just get really very delicately getting in between the valleys on that. And then this is an example of one of those pens, and you see how that tip is offset. So as you're holding it, you can look down and see the line that you're actually burning, but the whole tool's not in the way while you're doing it.
The guy that makes those pens would probably do a custom radius for you if you give him a little lead time.
Yeah. The I would like one of these pens, but without that curve, because I want to put it into a block of wood and then use that on the platform and burn on the platform, when I feel like I want to stand at the lathe for a few hours.
Yeah,
But
give
I
him
think
a
it'd be
phone call and
interesting.
send him a sketch, and I'm pretty sure that he can make you what you want. I placed an order
Yeah.
with him a few months ago, and he called me back and questioned every one of my choices just to make sure I knew what I was doing.
He is, we'll call it a character.
That's a good choice of words.
Yep. Silver pens. So Alan, how about pen touch silver pens? They may work. The only thing I would watch out for is bleed, is just, color choices, color options, and then is it going to bleed into the wood and color the bead next to it by accident? These Faber-Castells have been fine. There is another brand, I think somebody mentioned it earlier. I think it's the Micron, yeah. The Micron pens, they have those. And actually, if you go to Michael's, their Faber-Castell selection is poor, at least the one in Garner near me, but they have a bunch of the Micron brand with different colors.
I haven't seen
Did
much
you
bleeding
talk about,
there.
oh, sorry. Did you talk about burning along the bead lines as opposed to across the spoke lines? Do you burn in between the beads?
Yep. So while it's on the lathe and it's spinning, you can either use a real thin piece of maple, or like we talked about with the Formica. And so it's spinning and it's burning those in between the beads, or the valleys, let's call it. And then with that burn pen, you're burning those vertical lines. And you can not burn between while it's on the lathe and just use one of these pens with a super fine tip and run it. I've done that too, where I've just sat there and I've gone around and drawn in the black lines. Nobody knows the difference.
Michael, it just occurred to me that a clay carving tool with a wire loop and a wooden handle might be a hard enough wire to burn those circumferential lines that you're doing with the Formica.
Like on
for clay sculpting.
Yeah, like on, so here burning at that widest diameter with wire is awesome.
Yeah.
Here's when that wire won't kick. So what you're saying is that may be strong enough wire to get in there and burn those if you're holding it at an angle. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. That's it.
Okay.
That's what I was thinking.
I'd like to try that because I'm not a fan of the Formica.
Would also work on the platter application.
Yeah, I like that. So what was it? It's the clay.
Yeah, clay sculpting tools. There's a wire loop and a wooden handle for carving out, sculpting clay.
Gotcha.
Michael's or someplace like that, I'm sure would have them.
All right. I wonder something else too.
Basically,
I
it's
wonder.
a music wire formed in a tight loop and inserted into a handle.
I gotcha. Oh yeah, I think I've seen that when people are doing clay sculpting. I think I know exactly what you're talking about. I was trying to come up with something like there's got to be a way to be able to use the hook and wire, but then have something support it to give it tension. And I couldn't come up with it. I couldn't conceptualize it, but that what you suggested may just solve the problem.
Just as a reminder to everybody that the resource guide that Michael put together in this presentation will be putting up on the website. We'll probably get the resource guide up in the next few days. We have to do a little bit of work for the recording of tonight's session before we get it up there, but within the next week, hopefully we'll get that up there so that you can go back and revisit different pieces of it. If you kind of forget what Michael said about something or how he did it, you can go back and revisit that, just like the rest of all of our demonstrations. As many as we can, we repost for replay up there. Sometimes our demonstrators don't allow that, but Michael's given us permission to do that, so.
Yep. What's mine is yours.
Yeah.
Well, I would have paid more than the admittance price of the membership just to get all this brain dump today.
Yeah.
Well worth my new membership.
Oh, good.
Thanks,
We'll send you another bill then, David.
There you
Well,
go.
I was just-
We'll
I
apply
was
for
gonna give
next
David,
year.
now I owe David the $5. I told him I'd pay him if he said that.
Yeah, you thought this was gonna be a free demo, huh?
Yeah. I
Uh,
hope you guys
You
try
were
it.
saying,
Honestly,
you were saying it's gonna be a world record shortness, but I think that you laid the information out very easily for us to understand and explained it real well. Thank you. very
thank
much.
you.
Very good,
Thank you.
Michael.
yeah.
I won't lie, I stressed about it. I didn't want anybody to get bored, so I appreciate the feedback.
Very well done.
Yeah.
Good.